Hello, everyone. Woo. I wasn't expecting this. Okay. um, well, welcome, everyone. I am Alicia Perez Porro. I'm the head of policy engagement and institutional relations at CREAF, a research center in Barcelona, Spain. We work with ecology of climate change and biodiversity. And it is my pleasure today to talk about the Mediterranean and have this amazing group of speakers that I'm sure that are going to give you really interesting facts and information about this very lovely region that we all live in. So just I'm going to give you a little bit of opening remarks about why the Mediterranean, right? Why is this region so important? And why is this region so important for us? The Mediterranean is a region that is a hotspot for climate change and for biodiversity loss. It is actually warming up 20% faster than the rest of the world in average. On top of that, it's a region that is highly populated, and most people in the region live in cities, which presents a very important challenge in terms of adaptation. We are preparing, we are getting ready, and we are trying to be coordinated and organized under the umbrella of the UFM, the Union for the Mediterranean, and under another scientific umbrella, which is MEDEC. We will be talking about MEDEC a couple of times, so in case you don't know MEDEC, this is an important name to remember because it's a panel of experts in climate change, but not exclusively. And I'm not going to say anything else because I don't want to reveal the surprise, because I know that our next speaker is going to talk about it and some other speakers are also going to mention. But the important thing to remember is that the experts come from all the countries in the Mediterranean. It started in 2015 and we have already one assessment report, the MAR 1, and the cycle for the second assessment report, MAR 2, started actually last week. We were in Marseille. That was a kickoff meeting for all the authors. I'm also an author. I'm a lead author in one of the chapters. And this MAR 2, the second assessment for the Mediterranean, is going to be published in 2028. So look out for it because it's going to be really interesting. So I don't want to say anything else, otherwise we are not going to have time to listen to our amazing speakers. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction of each of them, because as you can imagine, their bios are like very, very long, because these are very successful people. So we have Anna Pirani, which is the Director of Predicting Socioeconomic Outcomes at the, and I'm going to practice my Italian now, Centro Euro-Mediterraneo sui cambiamenti climatici. She's also an author of IPCC in the Assessment Report 7, and she's been a focal point for IPCC in Italy. And she is also a CLA in the MEDEC MAR 2. Then we have Elena Olmos Carbonell, which is a Spanish youth delegate. Thank you, Elena, because it's so important to have the perspective of youth, especially in the Mediterranean region. And she comes from the University of Alicante. Then we have Dr. Ingie Johnston, and she's a researcher fellow in net zero aligned offsetting at the University of Oxford. She sits at the UNFCCC Article 6.4 expert roster. So hopefully you are going to give us some light on Article 6.4. Next to her we have Simon Plugger. It's the lead expert for international carbon at Climate and Company and a European Sustainable Finance think tank. He is on Article 6 and a specialist who has been following the negotiations closely, also their practical implementation. So Article 6. It's always so difficult for me to understand Article 6. And then at the extreme we have Cindy Cucci, She works at the she's the international policy advisor at Carbon Balance Initiative. She's also a researcher at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group with a particular focus on, you guessed it, Article 6. And here we also have like a very special person. First of all, because I like her very much, and second, because she comes from the UFM. She is Inés Duarte. She comes from the UFM Secretariat, and she works at the Energy and Climate Action Division. She's going to give us some opening remarks.
Thank you, Alicia. It's also a pleasure to see you, and it's also a pleasure to be here with you in COP30. Dear panelists, dear colleagues, and also the audience on site and online, thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today at the Spanish Pavilion. First of all, because the UFM headquarters is in Spain, so we're based in Barcelona. Secondly, because, as you know, the topic of science-policy interface is something that the UFM is backing for many years. And in the case of MEDEC, the UFM was originally backing their establishment since 2015. So it's a pleasure to be here. Also at COP30, the implementation COP, where we're celebrating the 10 years of the anniversary of the Paris Agreement. So I think that the stars are aligned. We're discussing science policy interface in the Mediterranean. For us, it's a big accomplishment because before MEDEC was set up, there was no Mediterranean as the region. I mean, the Mediterranean in the negotiations doesn't exist. We have the EU negotiation group, you have the Arab negotiation group, you have other countries like Monaco, but you don't have a Mediterranean negotiation group. And we know that member states in our constituency often sit in different sides of the negotiation. So having MEDEC coming together, producing sound scientific studies that back and help policymakers from the region present a case, it's very important for us. We would also like to flag that after the MAR1 report was launched, a few years after, IPCC launched the first report on the Mediterranean. So we want to believe that it was because of that. In any case, I mean, just in a nutshell, for us as the UFM, we are a major institutional supporter of MEDEC since its inception. For us, it's the principal science policy body that we refer to. We try to integrate the contributions of MEDEC in all our ministerial platforms, regional working groups, to make sure that, that we disseminate the studies and the wealth of information that is being produced. With MAR1, it was a huge success for us. And we know that MEDEC is now working on MAR2, and we want to make sure that the output and that MAR2 becomes a reference tool for the Mediterranean, as it was the case of MAR1. So that's our main goal. And then in terms of MEDEC, I mean, just to praise the fact that it's an independent network of over 700 scientists from over 35 countries in the region, and that it was also the winner of the North-South Prize of the Council of Europe in 2020. So, I mean, if that happened, it's a testament of the quality of the work being produced. Finally, I would also like to raise attention for our Mediterranean Pavilion at the other end of the corridor. We would like to invite you to stop by. The Mediterranean Pavilion is intended to be a house for all the member states of the region. As you know, the UFM represents 43 member states. I mean, Spain has a pavilion, other member states have a pavilion, but a lot, I mean, the majority of our member states do not. And that is the main idea behind the Mediterranean Pavilion, that is already in this 4th edition, is to actually provide a home and a space for member states representatives, be it at ministerial level, but also stakeholders from the region, to actually showcase and share the best practices of what they are developing. So thank you all. I'll stop here and I'll give the floor back to my friend Alicia. And it's always a pleasure to see you. You all are super smiley, and I wish you a very pleasant debate. Thank you.
give me a second so I can put all my notes here. Okay. So, so I'm going to ask you now a question that is a general question for all of you. Um, and I'm going to ask you to be slightly brief, like 2 or 3 minutes each. And also, if there's something that you want to highlight in this question about your own experience and your own bio that maybe I didn't mention, please go ahead. So you all work at different organizations, you all work at different perspectives, um, all in this umbrella of what climate change is. But what is the work that you do within your organization related to the Mediterranean? So I think that I'm going to start like at the end. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to take off my headphones because it's a bit tricky to talk in them. So my name is Cindy. I work at both the University of Oxford and also Carbon Balance Initiative. This is an NGO, which is an offshoot of Oxford. We are a group of Oxford academics that established it, and we try to create a very conducive regulatory environment to get to a state of geological net zero, which means to have a perfect balance of carbon sinks and sources in order to reach the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. When it comes to my work in the Mediterranean, I'm a little ashamed to admit that even though I'm from the Mediterranean myself, my work has not concentrated on the region so far. I've done a couple of interesting projects for the Western Balkans specifically, one of them being investigating the impacts of the EU CBAM measures on each of the 6 Western Balkan countries. But beyond that, I'm really interested to maybe have some more collaborations this next year with people sitting on this room or even beyond, to really understand what the capacities of the region are to help us reach the goal of the Paris Agreement. Potentially, what are the capacities to store carbon, for example? What are the capacities to scale removal technologies which will be necessary for us to reach net zero, either those be nature-based or technological-based? And what is the appetite really in the region to engage with international carbon market mechanisms? And how can we build capacities as a global north institution with potentially other institutions in the region? So yeah, if you have any ideas, if you want to reach out after this panel, I'll be more than happy to, and happy to also investigate some of these issues in the panel here today.
Thank you, Cindy. Simon.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd really like to apologize for messing up this all-women-led event here. I hope I can still stay, but yeah, really congratulations. So I also wanted to give a brief background. I am from Germany, but I live in the Mediterranean and I speak 3 languages, Catalan, Spanish, and Portuguese, so I deeply care about the Mediterranean. Regarding the organization I work for, so it's a sustainable finance think tank from Germany, but we work European-wide and globally. And we already collaborated with the Union for the Mediterranean on a green taxonomy and sustainable supply chain project. And me specifically, as you already introduced, I'm working a lot on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And in that regard, we already did some awareness raising and trainings, for example, at the Africa Carbon Markets Forum in Morocco. But also I was providing these 2 worlds together. So a science and a mitigation mechanism. And I really think for Article 6, and this is already a bit technical, I hope we can explain a little bit more, but what we need from scientists from the Mediterranean region for a high integrity implementation is we need them to calculate the real business as usual baselines, and also then calculate what is the ambition. So what is the part above the business as usual baselines for certain sectors in the Mediterranean countries, so that we actually are not repeating the mistakes of international carbon markets. And that really needs to be informed by the best available science from Mediterranean experts.
Thank you, Simon. And I have to confess that as a Catalan person, I really like the fact that you speak Catalan, and that was a total surprise coming from a German
Bona tarda.
Buona tarda.
Wonderful. Well, building off of the two first insights, I think I'll just briefly illustrate one part of the science part of our work at Oxford and one part of the policy interface. So in terms of the science, so we work on helping to coordinate a report called The State of Carbon Dioxide Removal. We have someone in the audience, Nico, who's our head of partnerships for the report. But that's a really exciting collaboration. It involves, again, similar to this report that we're discussing here, a global collaboration of scientists to really unpack and stocktake the extent of carbon dioxide removal that's occurring to date and really map out pathways to help address what's known as the CDR gap. Now, this CDR gap really matters for mitigation. It's indeed the only way that we can achieve a state of net zero, and critically, the only way we can go to a state of net negative emissions, which, as we heard, is critical for the Mediterranean region, given the extent of warming that's occurring. This is the only way to cool down the region. And so as part of that, we stocktake developments in the Mediterranean as well. And we're actually expanding to do some more kind of regional and country profiles, which we can also further explore as part of today's discussion. However, on the policy side of things, what's really critical is translating across that gap. So what does the gap of CDR mean in the policy world? And when we look to the Paris Agreement, there's various levers. But one of the least understood ones, as we've heard already today, is Article 6. And so really understanding how that as a market mechanism can actually better serve as a more efficient channel for capital to deliver reduction and removal projects. But at the same time, it's important we don't let Article 6 undermine climate ambition. So earlier this year, we released Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6 in collaboration with a number of different institutions. And this is particularly critical for Mediterranean states that are part of the EU, given the EU 2040 target and the announcement that up to half of residual emissions may be offset using this mechanism. However, it's also critical, some of our work in carbon markets more broadly spotlights some of the leadership in the region, for instance, in Portugal and the domestic crediting scheme set up there. You know, these mechanisms, ultimately if set up correctly, can act as a conduit to getting capital to the ground. However, gone wrong, they can easily end up funding hot air, and that's bad for the globe, but particularly the Mediterranean, given the impacts. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Inji.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm working at an interesting center called the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. And I've been there now 3 years, and it's a new world because I've actually been working in the international context until then. So in terms of working in the Mediterranean, I am an imposter. I work more on the development of global scenarios and narratives that are particularly relevant for the types of context that you've heard until now. So very much thinking about the aspirational goals of the Paris Agreement, the international negotiations, and how the scientific community feeds in comprehensive narratives that are inclusive and cover the spectrum of climate change. And so now working in a European and actually Mediterranean-centered, it's an international center. It's a really, really interesting experience for me because actually, apart from these type of research, which is also done there, a lot of the work we do at CMCC is at the urban scale, at the community scale, and so bridging this knowledge and these kind of information needs into the more global or regional and global assessment processes or the science policy interfaces is really where I'm having a lot of inspiration from the work that we do at CMCC. So we've been bringing this knowledge into the Mediterranean context. I was a coordinating lead author of a special report on coastal risks, and then into the European Climate Risk Assessment. So there was the first European Climate Risk Assessment that was commissioned through the European Environment Agency, and it's really important to see how the experience on the ground in the Mediterranean countries informs Europe as a whole. So we have a lot of experience and knowledge sharing that can happen thanks to being on the front line. As you said, the Mediterranean is a hotspot of climate change, and now we're in a position to really share this experience with Europe as a whole. Yeah, I leave it there. So I'm very much focused on the science policy interface, so translating now even the information we have at such scales into more international context. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Elena, go ahead.
So, hello everyone. In my case, I think I would like to divide kind of what it was during my studies. So I studied international relations and environmental law. So I think like living in Alicante, it's quite key to have research linked to the Mediterranean. So actually, I was researching in different initiatives taking place in the Mediterranean, but also on how it was a hotspot for climate change. And then right now I work in the University of Alicante in the Office of Institutional Project Management, and we actually are currently really involved in projects that take place in the Mediterranean basin. So they are mainly EU-funded projects such as NextMed, Interreg, or also in this kind of initiatives on capacity building and so on and so forth. And yeah, I think that's mainly my perspective. I think it hasn't been only on climate change, but of course climate change and environmental matters always matter in other projects. So for example, right now we are involved in one on participation, like governance, participatory governance, and it's very much focused on piloting solutions on the community. And one of the focus of this initiative is also on green solutions.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you all. I think that this is my, okay, apologize. Okay, so I'm going to ask you like different questions now to each of you, and I'm going to start with Anna, because Anna, you're looking at me, so. And Anna, we were talking about MEDEC, we were talking that we were in Marseille last week, but I want you to explain to the audience what's the added value of MEDEC in relation to IPCC and IPBES.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that you have a good background on the IPCC and IPBES. So these are international intergovernmental bodies that assess the knowledge basis on climate change and biodiversity. They produce substantive reports that go through formal processes of review, including international experts and including technical experts from governments. And then the final process of this production is an act of co-design live, where in a plenary session, the summary of these assessment reports is approved line by line with governments. So it's an incredible science policy dialogue where you have live the exchange, which ultimately talks about clarity in the message. It's a very constructive process, and even towards the very end, the very last week of production, it's discussed at the highest level and very intensely with governments around the world and representatives of the expert communities. So MEDEC is building on this model, and it emerged very granularly, bottom up, from the scientific community in the Mediterranean, seeing an opportunity for this kind of dialogue to really take shape amongst these countries. So it's an interesting fact, the fact that it came from the scientific community. But it also, on the other side, it isn't so strongly grounded, I would say, in the governmental process. And I think that's an area that probably will continue to grow going forwards through the assessment reports. But what it means actually that the report process developed in a way that the scientific community felt was perhaps most useful to policymakers in the region. And this means that it's not just about climate change. It brings together climate change, biodiversity, the environment. So it's the Mediterranean expert group on the environment and climate change. And this is something we're not able to achieve at the international level. So we actually feel impeded somehow from joining this triple crisis situation or polycrisis situation in the way we assess knowledge and deliver policy relevant information. At the international level, these are kept separated. Whereas in the Mediterranean, we have this opportunity. And so we are exploring much more concrete nexus approaches to addressing the polycrisis, not only from a scientific perspective, but also from a policy-making perspective. So I would say MEDEC is at the forefront, really, of this type of message development or communication development. What else can I say? I mean, it means that, in the context of the Mediterranean, we have an opportunity also to be more innovative in terms of experiences, like you mentioned, the type of research we're doing in the Mediterranean, also in CMCC itself, where we connect much more closely to constituencies at the smaller scales. So we go from the government national level to urban scale or community level, and so the participatory process of developing knowledge that is relevant for policy making is something that we have in the Mediterranean across our region, and it's quite unique actually that we can bring that process into our regional scale assessment. So these are just a couple of characteristics, I think, that distinguish the Mediterranean assessment reports and shows the added value. And just to give you some foresight of what the new IPCC report will have, it'll have not only the Mediterranean cross-chapter paper, which was very nicely linking across these two processes. It's interesting that what's been developed, and we're really at the start of the process, so watch this space. But the idea is to talk about Mediterranean regions. And so in the IPCC, it took me a while to get used to this, because when you think about adaptation, it's all about the context. How do we go global on aspects around adaptation? And actually, I'm starting to learn about this idea where we have a shared conditions, climatic conditions in many different regions, the California region, Mexico, in southern Africa, in southern parts of America, and we can actually share experiences of our different communities, different contexts. So I think it's going to be a really enriching process in the IPCC, and this will feed back into the Mediterranean again. So a critical thing will be, as we produce reports all for 2028, we'll be having good alignment and synergies, basically, that we can work on and deliver the most sort of comprehensive perspective globally, but also to our own constituencies in the Mediterranean region. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And it's really interesting that you're mentioning this chapter from the IPCC. So the Catalan government with the Californian government started an intergovernmental association of different bioregions, MCAP. And I think that, as you mentioned, we can learn a ton, especially because like a lot of the things that are happening at different scales in different Mediterranean regions are hitting us at home. And I think that, Elena, coming from Alicante, you probably know a lot about the negative effects of climate change in our coast. And the thing that I wanted to ask you specifically is, what do you think that are the mechanisms that we are missing to better translate this science into action in communities like yours in Alicante?
Yeah, so thank you a lot. So as a professional, like a young professional working in a hotspot like Alicante, I want to emphasize that I think it's not a lack of science what we are having here. I think here is like evident how many people are working in the science, and I believe we are not lacking that, but rather the mechanisms on how to translate this science into coordinated actions across borders. So I was reviewing the drafted chapters for these second reports, and I already saw that there's a kind of a difference regarding like the first report, and I really like, because I think it's already like a first step. I think there's already more emphasis on how to address impact of climate change, but also on how to bring policies, governance, and economic instruments. And I think this is a first step already on bringing science into action. Then, but I think it's also important to emphasize the role of science diplomacy, and I think here we are a bit of a representation of what science diplomacy can be. Thinking about mechanisms, I think like I could like maybe think about 3 mechanisms that could be implemented. So first of course, like stable funding for knowledge transfer and cooperation. As I was mentioning before, I think there's already like EU programs which kind of evidence like what is needed in this sense. So I think both, for example, the Next Med, and the West Med initiatives, they both emphasize this multi-level partnership and how important it is to not only bring up with solutions, but to pilot these solutions in the context. And I think in the one that I was talking before on participatory governance, it's already really key how this is done. Then secondly, I think it's important that we have these kind of spaces, so to promote these dialogues between different stakeholders, between agents, practitioners, people from municipalities, young people, and I think regional organizations such as UFM can be like kind of supporting these processes. And third, I think it's important also to have harmonized and accessible data in order to kind of put this in place. And lastly, I wanted to say that young professionals can strengthen also this science policy practice interface by acting as science diplomats. And on the one side, I think we are prepared to understand scientific material, but also I think we have a key role as a bridging actor between research institutions, but also civil society. And I think this should be like highlighted and encouraged. And also youth plays an important role in pushing climate action. I think this is evident on how we can advocate and demand kind of further engagement from institutions or municipalities. For example, in the case of universities, I've been like, I know about this initiative that has been actually pushed by the UFM on the Girona Manifesto. I don't know if probably you know about it, but it's this Euromed climate alliance between universities. And I think in this sense, for example, the students and kind of like young people have an opportunity to push further engagement and to push their institutions to engage on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. And you mentioned something that I actually love, which is science diplomacy. I consider myself a science diplomat, and the UFM, I don't know, Ines probably left, but the UFM has a great program in science diplomacy. They are doing a lot of work, and I think that science diplomacy in a region like the Mediterranean is a very important topic, because sometimes we all know the geopolitical situation in the Mediterranean. There's no need for me to mention this right now, but I think that sometimes through science we can build collaborations, we can build cooperation in a region that is, the equilibrium is very fragile right now. So in the Mediterranean, science diplomacy has a special connotation that maybe it doesn't have in other places or in other regions. So thank you for bringing this topic up. It was a very important one. And Simon, I wanted to ask you, so you have been working in mitigation for a while, and what are the current trends, and how can we apply these trends in the Mediterranean region to contribute to this mitigation agenda?
So, so when it comes to the current, let's say, mitigation trends, especially since we're here at COP and in the Paris, under the Paris Agreement. So I think to set a bit the stage on more the side of this room, what we come from. So Article 6, as I already introduced, is a mitigation mechanism. And it's one of the main mitigation cooperation mechanisms that the Paris Agreement has, so to say. So I would definitely say it's a current trend, because we finalized the rules in Baku on it, and now we are in the implementation phase. However, there's additional negotiations going on specific standards still that are trying to be, for example, reopened and so. And I mean, this is again also bridging to the scientists. We are concerned that they are not informed by the best available science. But I think to bridge a little bit the gap, what is the trend, and also with the scientific community. So Article 6 is a mitigation mechanism. The MEDEC and the IPCC, I really hope that in practice they inform the policymakers in their NDCs, so to say. So when the policymakers are, I mean, we had it in Europe, so the European Scientific Advisory Body informs the European climate target, and then that becomes the NDC. But I really hope, and I guess that's what you're doing in your day-to-day work, I'm super excited to hear more about it, that the same thing happens also in the Mediterranean. And why I'm saying this is because Then when we come to the mitigation mechanism, which Article 6 is, so the foundation of Article 6 is the NDC. And that was also what I mentioned in the beginning. It's really important to define in the NDC the sectors where the countries in the Mediterranean need support. And those sectors, they need to define as well a baseline. So, and that needs to be the baseline, that will be the unconditional NDC, so that the countries of the Mediterranean can reach without additional support. But then obviously, what is the beyond? And that is very much, very often a very politicized process that maybe is not informed by the best available science, because of course in practice what can happen is that you just put those mitigation activities in the part of the conditional NDC that actually you don't need support from, but you should actually do it the way around, so that we are hiring the ambition, and that should be informed by science. And that is really important, and that's, I think, really something that is needed, because then the NDCs in practice, when it comes to Article 6 implementation, they inform the carbon market frameworks that are being built around the NDCs. So the carbon market frameworks, then they take the specific sectors and specific activities that can be financed via this mechanism. And this whole process should be really accompanied by science. Because if not, if it's only a politicized process, we risk repeating the same mistakes that we were doing in the clean development mechanism. And I think to sum it up, so what are the trends? So a lot of host and buyer countries, they are gearing up to use this mechanism, and they are ready to receive investment and also invest themselves. And I think this is obviously also an opportunity for the Mediterranean countries to receive investment and higher the ambition in their NDCs if it's informed by the best available science.
Thank you, Simon. And another of my favorite topics, science for policy, not only science diplomacy. And I think that this was a very specific idea, right? Like how science can inform the NDCs of the countries in the Mediterranean, because without that information, it's not that efficient, and we really need this connection. And how MEDEC doesn't happen in a vacuum. So MEDEC needs to take into consideration the other international global frameworks and bring them to the reality that we have in our region. So Cindy, you also work in mitigation and you also work with Article 6. So do you have any other specific idea? Do you have any other main issue that we should be considering at MEDEC to reflect current policy developments in Article 6?
Yes, definitely. So when I think of policy developments in Article 6, I first think of the developments that happen within the infrastructure of the mechanisms. So, and then like national engagement, so how countries specifically are engaging with Article 6. In terms of what is happening within the infrastructure itself, as Simon just mentioned, we are now in the area of operationalizing these mechanisms. So a lot of the crucial elements, specifically of Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, so cooperative approaches and more standardized crediting, these have already been kind of negotiated, and we're now just in the last, even though a bit frustrating, kind of discussions on how to implement some of the technical elements of these mechanisms. And then Article 6.8, which is non-market mechanisms or approaches, that is still up to negotiation. So now we have an almost finalized mechanism, but the Article 6 operates under public international law, right? And it needs to be translated into national legislations, into frameworks, policies, voluntary guidance from specific ministerial authorities in order to be responsibly engaged with and implemented. And it is overall a very flexible mechanism as well. So it is really up to the host countries, to the buyer countries, and all the other actors engaging with it to do so responsibly and in a science-based way. And at Oxford, not to toot our own horn, but we have done a lot of thinking about this, and with Ingi as lead author earlier this year, we also released a roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulations. And we really wanted to create these pathways for countries to create laws, policies, and frameworks to engage with not just Article 6, but international carbon markets in their entirety, also including voluntary carbon markets, national ETS frameworks as well, which are all converging and integrating, and how to do so in a way that really is evidence-based and takes us to the goal of the Paris Agreement rather than undermines it. We have seen in the Mediterranean specifically, there have been very interesting policy developments about this, specifically Portugal and Spain. Portugal, as Indra just mentioned, has created its own domestic voluntary carbon market. It does not allow the use of these domestic credits for engagement with Article 6 or even other international frameworks like Corsia, which is a aviation carbon market. But it's very interesting to see how Mediterranean countries under the EU, which has those climate neutrality targets and targets to really use carbon credits to reach climate neutrality, and non-EU Mediterranean countries, where are they departing? Where are they coordinating with each other? And as I mentioned as well, like we truly need this coordination and this evidence base and science to really inform the regulatory approaches to Article 6. So I think one thing that we can take away from this, other than really alignment of science with NDCs and then engagement with Article 6, is how can science inform the entire region as a whole, and how we can really coordinate and integrate our regulatory responses to this mechanism.
Thank you, Cindy, and very much at the core of what MEDEC is trying to do, right? And you mentioned national engagement, you mentioned coordination and evidence-based, and this brings me to Ingi, because you recently launched an observatory on climate carbon market in the Mediterranean region. So what drove you to start this initiative, and how could it help to current MEDEC report that is just starting?
Thank you so much. And so yes, over the past year, we've been collaborating with a number of other academic institutions and civil society organizations to develop what's called the Article 6 Observatory, which we're very excited to formally launch this week. Indeed, you're all invited 4 p.m. at the WWF Pavilion on Thursday the 20th. But as part of that, we really seek to fill the gap in two key areas to help address some of the issues that Simon and Cindy have mentioned. This is related to the transparency of this cooperation in terms of how efficient this cooperative mechanism that is housed within Article 6 is, but also the integrity question. And so a lot, both in the EU as well as beyond in other Mediterranean countries, effects of the clean development mechanism, of joint implementation, have been felt in terms of non-delivery of units, in terms of hot air being let into, say, the EU emissions trading scheme. And so in all, with Article 6, compared to the former clean development mechanism and other Kyoto Protocol carbon trading mechanisms, far more is included, which means there's far more at risk in terms of getting it wrong. So this is where critical insights that are independent from those outcomes, are either not driven by government or business interests, are able to look at the evidence base and apply some clear recommendations for best practice as a result of that. Now, as we've heard, we're still very early days in terms of the operationalization of Article 6, but we can already see some important lessons that have been learned. And this includes all the same things that science tells us that we need to address. For instance, ensuring additionality of projects. So would this project have otherwise already occurred? Ensuring that permanence and risk of reversal is managed. Indeed, obviously, as we know, sadly, the Mediterranean suffers a lot from wildfires. And so how do we ensure that those kind of mitigation investments are resilient? And again, science tells us a lot of information, and particularly that interface between mitigation and adaptation. And one thing that's also quite interesting is under Article 6 is that a greater share of proceeds from Article 6.4 transactions will be going to the adaptation fund. So this is, again, I think another key area that the Mediterranean can stand to benefit from responsible engagement with these mechanisms, is actually looking not only towards the mitigation potential, but also the adaptation potential, because there's huge need within the region to ensure and grade in resiliency in a science-led manner. So with the observatory, we seek to tie all these different insights together to provide a repository of the latest evidence, and really steward the next generation of international researchers in this space to be able to contribute insights, again, to the longevity of the Paris Agreement, because as Elena mentioned, us, young researchers and youth in general have a huge stake in the system that's being created, because it's designed to last the lifetime of the Paris Agreement. And if we don't get the rules right from the outset, it's a lot harder to shift those later down the line. So that's what we hope to do as part of the observatory. Again, if you're an academic institution or CSO or otherwise keen to get involved and find out more about the observatory, please come and speak to us. But again, we also invite you to the formal launch on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingi. We will try our best to be there and support you. So, all the things that you were saying, which I think that they're very important and useful to say them out loud. But now I'm going to just go back to just ask you a general question, because everything that you are saying, kind of like all the paths go to Rome, all your things goes to like evidence-based and science for policy and science informing, and like this component of the role of science policy interface at different scales, at different levels in the Mediterranean, right? So I want you to ask you to give you your perspective on how can we advance the science policy interface in the region to accelerate not only mitigation, but also adaptation and environmental protection. 1, 2, 3, go. Let's do, you know what? Let's do, okay, Elena, Anna, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I want to pick up on something that Ines said at the beginning. So there is no negotiation bloc for the Mediterranean. And I'm actually the lead negotiator for the EU in the research and systematic observation agenda item here. And what we see is that science is being discussed in terms of, there is some, how to say, distrust about the best available science. And this is just so sad. And I think in the Mediterranean region, we have an opportunity to work with partners across negotiation blocs. I'm not sure how many other contexts exist like this. So it's a question of building back trust on how science is a global commons. And I think it speaks to a lot of the comments that were made and all across the panel, actually, the need for open and transparent data, the need to connect priorities across adaptation and mitigation. And in this nucleus that we have in the Mediterranean, we're able to do that. So I'm really hoping that actually the MEDEC reports will strengthen its connection to the policy interface in the Mediterranean and help us bridge a divide that shouldn't be existing, actually, across negotiations at the international level. So I think we're going to make a lot of progress thanks to this context that we have that's quite unique in the Mediterranean. And amazingly, the mitigation and decarbonization chapter in the report is there for the first time. So please come and review. Please come and feed in, because it's lovely to hear you reviewed the outline. There's not so much awareness of this process, and it's actually open to all to participate in reviewing and help shaping and supporting the authors, one on the policy relevance, but also on the literature and the science basis. And just to reiterate, one important precept is that these reports are based on published literature. Internationally, we're striving to have a broader and more inclusive assessment of all the diverse knowledge base that is available. In the Mediterranean Assessment Report, I think we're going to be able to do a really advance the assessment of non-English based literature. So, I really hope that you will be helping to contribute that process, so that really builds the trust in what the assessment is trying to achieve. But it needs participation to reach that point. So here are some wish lists, I think more than one from my side, but MEDEC will certainly help. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. So who wants to go next? I'm going to start naming you. So Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, so in our field of work in Article 6, this really coming back on the science policy interface, so I think it's very heated. I want to put that at front right now, because especially in the Article 6.4 space, that is governed by the supervisory body mechanism of the UN. We had recently, so the SBM in a way is putting the standards for the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and those standards, they're done by the members of the supervisory body mechanism, and those standards are supposed to be done with the availability of the best available science. And what we have experienced is that we are experiencing right now a little bit of a conversation and a discussion and sometimes an argument between market actors and scientists and also civil society organizations. And I think that dialogue is important, but what we are worried about is that market interests overtake scientific evidence, and that is what we have seen. And also let me mention one point, because I'm observing that space a little bit as an independent think tank. What I observe is, so what the market actors are annoyed by is obviously the simple facts, the evidence that you cannot compensate methane emissions that you're causing with planting trees somewhere else, or forest carbon stock that a standing forest absorbs over the year. So I think that's pretty clear. But what they are also annoyed by is the brutality of those facts. And I think they don't, so to say, to enter into a constructive dialogue between market actors, and I'm also saying policymakers here, because I usually have the feeling that policymakers, they get more input from market actors than from scientists. So here, policy and science. I think what we need more is we need also to scientifically report on those projects and those cases, specifically under Article 6, that do work. Because there are initiatives that do work. For example, it's very difficult in the forest sector, but there are projects that are, for example, in the transportation sector or in the renewable energy sector that can bring really sustainable development and reduce emissions, and that this can be used. And right now, I think, and I'm not telling scientists to stop to report on the things that don't work, but I'm encouraging to also report on the mitigation activities that do work, because the solution can also not be that we don't implement this mechanism at all, because I mean, we're lacking, there's no way to reach the amounts of the finance needed in a way, so we need all the instruments that are available. So I think to really, to sum it up, to report on the things that don't work so that we don't do them anymore, but also on the ones that do work, to create a bit of a more positive atmosphere, because that is not always the case in our space.
Thank you, Simon. Elena, do you want to go next? Because I see you with the microphone.
Thank you. I was reflecting on everything that you said, and I think it's really relevant what you mentioned on the negotiate. Like, I've been also participating, well, like observing the negotiations this last week, and I guess it's really, really key, the fact that you have negotiators from Arab group and European Union sitting in kind of different opposite sides when there's so many common challenges that we are facing. And again, I go back to the need of cooperation, but I want to also bring like the importance on listening to science and on the science diplomacy, on the thing that like evidence is there, and I believe we have to go away from ideologies and like statements and be more like, what is science saying? Because I think this is really, when you talk, like I think also because I've been involving myself in like youth spaces, and you talk with people from the both sides of the basin of the Mediterranean, and you see that our demands are kind of similar because we face different challenges. So our speech is aligned, but then the negotiations have different speeches, and it doesn't really make sense. So I think, I both think that negotiators should be listening to scientists, but also to civil society that normally are more linked, even though there's some sectors that sometimes put in evidence like science, it's not. But I think mostly civil society is demanding more. And I believe it's in that cooperation, in that, like, I don't know, like those dialogues that we can bring about solutions.
Thank you, Elena. Cindy.
Yeah, thank you. It's been very interesting listening to all of your perspectives on this, and it makes me think that on the interface between science and policy, we also have a lot of other different interests like civil society, market actors, and how do they interface and engage on this link between science and policy, right? And how do they dilute or strengthen science when it then translates into policies and into laws and into NDCs and so on? And how they can this undermine or strengthen our response to climate change. So I think what this makes me think, what we might need is really try to breach the gap and create kind of bridges of communication and translation between all of these different actors and interests. Because what I hear in these negotiation rooms is that we all want the same thing. We are all trying to get to the same like temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. It's just we all need to take each other's like interests as well, because I do understand the private actors and the market actors at some point about the economic viability of a lot of these projects, right? And I do understand the perspective of civil society who are asking for more transparency and accountability, and also of the scientists themselves that say this is what we are dealing with, these are the impacts, and this is the urgency of the situation. So yeah, I think that is a very long-winded answer to say that maybe we need to create more bridges between the different interests in this space, particularly within the Mediterranean basin. As you were saying, like the Mediterranean is a very geopolitically diverse region as well. What one country will think is scientifically, the science of one country does not align with the science of another country. Like, yeah, the Western Balkans, for example, where I'm from, do not really have the same strategies in engaging with these climate challenges as do Spain or Portugal. So I think we do also need to consider the diverse views in the region as well, and how science then can inform policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Inji.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know we're coming to the end, so I'll be very brief. But I think there's two key things as part of building those bridges. I think us as academics and others engaged in civil society more broadly need to get to what we know in academia as the so what a lot quicker. So what are the implications of our research? And I was really heartened to see that MEDEC produces a summary for policymakers to help with that translation exercise. But the easier we make it for the negotiation room to translate that science into policy, the better. And a very practical example of this was when the issue of tenure accounting came up. And there's peer-reviewed literature out there about why that's really not a good idea. So it was just about connecting the dots to share that peer-reviewed literature with the negotiators, just to emphasize the importance of why it doesn't belong in something like the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. However, it's also interesting on the other side. I think when we think about the science policy interface and building those bridges, I think there's also a very practical translation point. And I really liked, Anna, your point about kind of saying we need more, science and other literature that's not in English, and a real effort to really collate evidence and then also do that cross-pollination back to those other languages, and particularly in somewhere so diverse such as the Mediterranean. I think that can really help build bridges too, because when you're speaking not only the language in terms of substantively the content that is engaging to an audience, but also their own language, I think people naturally have more of a buy-in and understanding, and are much better able to then apply it domestically on the ground. So yeah, just like to pick up that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Inji. So basically, what I've been hearing among all of you is that we need to bridge these gaps, right? Like there's a lot of different stakeholders. We all speak different languages, not only different real languages, but also different professional languages. And we also need to connect those languages as well. And I want to say that at the MEDEC meeting last week, we mentioned that beyond the summary for policymakers would be a nice initiative to have a summary for citizens, because it's also important to inform the citizens if we want them on board of all of these policies that we are like trying to inform, right? Otherwise, they are not going to make them the policies theirs, and they're not going to want to implement them. I also really like the mention that Ines said about like that there is no negotiation bloc for the Mediterranean, how important it is to be represented as a bloc, as a region in all of these spaces, and all the need for this science policy interface at different levels to connect all the evidence and to bring it to where it needs to be. And Simon, while you were talking, I was thinking about something that has nothing to do with Article 6, which is Mediterranean diet. And I thought about the culture that we have at the Mediterranean, right? In the Mediterranean region, we're very proud of the Mediterranean diet. And I always say that that's not the only thing that we share. We also have a climate identity, a climate culture that we share. And you made me think about how the Mediterranean started as a region. It was because of commerce and trade, and how important that can be when we design our own carbon market with that perspective of a shared identity. So we are 5 minutes past. I think this is the reason of the noise, so I'm going to stay like this. So we are 5 minutes past. Can I go ahead and use a little bit more? Okay. So, oh my God, it's really unnerving me. I want to ask you a question, and this is the reason why probably you keep asking me to be a moderator, that is not on the script. So don't panic. I just want one sentence from each of you. That's it. So this is the COP that we are celebrating 10 years of the Paris Agreement. It's a very important COP, not only because of that. I want you to give us, what do you wish for the next 10 years? What do you want to see? One sentence. Anna, don't give me that look. Come on, you can do it.
And I have to start as well. No, I was just essentially going to say that we understand each other, that we are able to, we're not going to speak necessarily the same language, but at least we are on a common footing of where we're trying to go to together, that we can imagine together the next 10 years and how we want to work together. I think multilateral cooperation is central, trust and understanding, and that takes time, so maybe it'll be something we work on the next 10 years, but that shouldn't detract from the urgency of action. The science, you said, well, my science is like this, and my science. The science at the end of the day is not partisan, and it doesn't come from one country or another. Our experience and understanding of the local context and the drivers and the implications do come from our context, and so we need those spaces whereby the scientific information is a shared common good. So understanding and having the space for dialogue, and we do that in MEDEC, even in the first meeting. It takes time to see where we're coming from, the perspectives and the language we use, and ultimately we actually get to a very similar ground, as others have said. Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, I want to use this occasion to let the audience know that my colleagues there, they have there the letters of hope, and basically in those letters we are collecting what are your wishes for the next 10 years of the Paris Agreement. I already filled up mine, so basically I'm gonna tell you what I put in that letter. So as I said, like last week I had the opportunity to get involved in many of the negotiations, and I think on the one side that we compromise with the NDCs, that we do all the countries compromise with it, and they do the efforts to try to keep into this 1.5 degree. Then also I've been following the financial negotiations, and I think I think they are normally the ones that get more stuck because money. But I believe that there has already been done like a good step on like this definition of the Baku to Belém roadmap, and I believe that brings an opportunity to operationalize the mitigation and adaptation efforts. And I think this should not be just a roadmap, but it needs to be brought into an agreement, and really like that the countries really, like the parties really compromise to it and commit to delivering it. And lastly, I wish for kind of spaces in which kind of young people and indigenous and other people, they are not just like in the periphery, but that they participate really in the decision-making processes. Because I feel like it's not about giving symbolic power, but more about giving responsibility to these agents. And yes, I wanted to say kind of like that we need to get involved in policies that in the end we are going to face the consequences in the end. So yeah, that's it.
Who's next? Inji, come on.
Yeah, I think in the next 10 years, I really hope we just appreciate that the science is clear. You know, we all know the direction of travel, and I think the implications, sadly, in the next 10 years are only going to become even clearer. So I hope that we can use that as the start for that common understanding that, Anna, you were mentioning, and then focus our efforts on really driving what we can. And we've seen how the world can come together in times of crisis, like with COVID, and that really, when there's a will, there's a way. So I really hope that in the next 10 years we see that. And just one point to end on, we can also look at where we were nearly 10 years ago when we were staring down the barrel of a 4 to 5 degree world. And so I think also acknowledging how far we've come just in that time, we've shown what's possible, but now we have to do whatever we can. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say something very unpopular, but it's something that the spaces that we are in, because the beauty of Article 6 is that you're always surrounded by science, by market actors, by policymakers, and by civil society. So what I really hope for the next 10 years is that we are not getting too greedy, especially in our space, because I don't think that this is an environmental market mechanism, and this is not, we shouldn't apply pure neoclassical economics to this market mechanism. So it is integrated into the planetary boundaries, and I really think everybody can earn money by using this market mechanism, but let's not become too greedy and really compromise planetary interests over profit. And then a bit more practically looking forward for Article 6 in the next 10 years, I would really hope that the projects that are being implemented, especially also in the Mediterranean context, of course that they follow the best available science, that they are high integrity, but also from a development cooperation perspective, that they really support the NDCs, the specific sectors that the countries of the Mediterranean need, that they don't support projects that maybe the Mediterranean doesn't need, and that we actually also start to think about, Inji also mentioned it, there is this share of proceeds for the adaptation fund, that we start to think of how we can value the co-benefits, and they are specifically important in the context of the Mediterranean, because adaptation is one of the big issues that you have to deal with as one of the, I think, warming, the fastest warming region in the world, I think 20% faster than other regions. And my last point is to go beyond that and also even include fragility and security reasons with such projects under Article 6 and take all these co-benefits into account. And I really hope that those are the projects that actually will get implemented, leading to mitigation and both sustainable development.
Thank you, Simon. Cindy, you're the last one.
Oh, I'm feeling the pressure of being the last speaker. I would say in 10 years' time, perhaps I'm a bit of an optimist, but I would really like to be in a world in which we're no longer talking about the scary concept of overshoot or exceeding even the temperature limits of the Article 6, and we're really concentrated on adapting, creating a more adapted and resilient world, one in which really cares for natural ecosystems and also for human development and the local context as well. So we've halted global warming, and we're now thinking about real human development, which I think sometimes might be missing in these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. And that's a wrap. Thank you all. Thank you, speakers.